and welcome to this episode of No Free Lunch, Economics for a Fallen World. In some prior episodes, we've talked a bit about macroeconomics. Keynesian economics has been called the new economics in contrast to classical economics.
Sure.
Talk about that a bit, please.
Yeah, Keynesian economics, as we've alluded to in some of the previous videos, really came about in the aftermath of his general theory. It took the world by storm. It was popularized very quickly in America by Paul Samuelson with his PhD dissertation and then best-selling textbook. And really, his textbook was best-selling for next 50 years or so, the Samuelson textbook, which really adopted much of Keynes's focus on what we now call aggregate demand. We're going to get to that in a subsequent video. But for the way to think about it, I've got a chart here. I think I'll take the chart to think about it from the book. You can think about the macroeconomy. The overall economy has a certain amount of resources, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship that would be involved in producing things. And you've really got two kind of choices on what you can do with this. You can use these resources in what we call the private sector. That's where you think about the market economy being. But also you can apply some of those monies in the public sector. And so you could make the economy of the public sector bigger or smaller by moving the amount of expenditure you do. But notice, when you make, in this way of viewing the economy, this would be more the classical way of looking at it. If you spend more on the public sector, what must necessarily be true about the private sector? Well, if you move this darker yellow line over this way, the private sector has
gotten smaller.
It's gotten smaller. It's pretty obvious. This is kind of the way that economists thought about the economy. So the government, in large part, and the governments were very small, even when Keynes had written this, other than wartime, and even wartime, the private economy was very large. In fact, interestingly enough, in World War II, the reason we have GDP figures today is Simon Kuznets. Many of the war planners were asked to try to figure out how much productive capacity we could bring to bear to fight the Germans, and nobody knew. Nobody knew what was involved in the actual production capacity of the United States and Britain and other countries. And so that's why we have what we have today. That's a tidbit. That's what we call a bonus, worth less than you paid for. It will not be on the exam. But nevertheless, so this is the way we thought about it. For the government to spend more, the private sector could spend less. And the Keynesian world says, no, there's something different about this. That this would lead, when you have a price adjustment and everything, you're going to get market clearing, and you're going to always have this kind of equilibrium focus. And Keynes says, this isn't the way the world really works. In fact, you can have underemployment equilibrium, and you can be stuck there. And what you need in that kind of case is the government to come in and spend. So let's go over and look on the right-hand side. And the right-hand side, this would be the Keynesian view. And you've got a public sector and a private sector again. But notice our land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship that's being used by the private sector. In the Keynesian world, there's a whole bunch of idle resource inputs that are out there. There are factories that are empty. There are people that are unemployed. And if we can just have the government spend to hire these idle resources, then when they get jobs and they get this purchasing power, they'll be able to buy stuff from the private sector, those goods, with the money that it's created. That will stimulate this sector and get it going back again. It's going to be kind of a virtuous circle up. You're going to get some stimulus into that. And we have this kind of discussion today. We often call politicians, in fact, as we're recording this, the Biden administration is preparing to take power in January, and there are calls for what kind of stimulus they will have when they start the economy. What kind of government spending in the aftermath of the COVID-19 coronavirus, can we take some of the idle resources and employ them more fully? So that's kind of this idea of the Keynesian macroeconomy. In fact, Keynes in his general theory said, and to this day, his devotees do not know if he was kidding or if he was serious. He says, if you can't think of anything better to do, you can pay people to dig a hole in the ground, bury jars of money covered up, and let other people dig it up to spend it. Now, he says, to be sure, it would be better off if we built houses and the like, but if you can think of nothing better to do, do this. And again, True Keynesians do not know if he was kidding or serious at this point. But nevertheless, it certainly fits with Keynesian theory because it would stimulate the purchasing power, would stimulate. And so that's kind of the way the Keynesians would view this. And here's the interesting part. If you can successfully hire idle resource inputs that essentially have no opportunity cost, then there is a free lunch. And that's what our textbook denies, is there is always an opportunity cost. And we may get into some of that discussion.
And this model, as you were talking about that, these ovals that you presented there, that's the size of the economy, and that's static, right?
That's a static way of viewing it.
So it's not really asking, which leads to greater growth, or the size of the economy, what causes it to grow or something. That's a different conversation.
That's a different conversation, economic growth. Okay. Right. But let me finish with one thing to say. Okay, well, how does this work? Here's if you were in my class, and by watching this video today, you are in my class. I would say, this might have been plausible in the 1930s, when basically a working man, which was in that time, could go from one factory to another and basically interchange. We would have what we would call homogeneous labor. We could move capital and labor fairly easily back and forth. But right now, what we have is what we would call heterogeneous, or specific to a particular occupation. Most of our students today, most of our workers have highly specialized skills. The division of labor we have, it takes a while to retrain. So, for instance, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, which you mentioned earlier, in the financial crisis, we had a housing bubble that had burst. We had massive numbers of employment as mortgage brokers, as carpenters, as other things. And the government spending that the Obama administration did at that time, they wanted green energy. They wanted to send money to the states. They wanted to rebuild roads and bridges. Well, mortgage brokers do not design bridges. They do not build bridges. Carpenters actually don't build bridges either. There's construction, but it's a different kind of construction skill. And it's one of the reasons we saw that the government stimulus in the aftermath of the financial crisis led to very little reduction in unemployment. So this idea that there is no opportunity cost, that you can somehow, with public sector spending, take from idle resources only, does not seem to match the reality of what we see today, which is one of the reasons Keynesian estimates of multiplier and how big the stimulus would lead to never seem to bear fruit. In fact, much of the public sector spending will actually tend to draw from other uses of the land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. We're glad you joined us for this episode of No Free Lunch.